Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris with BeyondPay. I'd like to welcome you to one of the many educational webinars we provide for our customers and our colleagues, and sometimes even our competitors. So at BeyondPay, we are guided here by three simple principles, and they are to learn, collaborate, and care. So let me start by saying thank you for being a customer. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We care about you. We care about your day. We care about your reputation, and we care about your success. So thank you. As many of you already know, BeyondPay does more than just payroll. We work with hundreds of companies to help with various areas of their HR. Our goal is to find the perfect mix of technology and service to complement your HR team. So we want you to actually use your HR technology, and that's the BeyondPay difference. So we've developed a new offering to help you get there. We call it Managed HR, and we believe it can supercharge your team and your company. So stay tuned, as you'll be hearing more about this in the days and weeks ahead. But back to the core values: learn, collaborate, and care. Today's webinar is heavy on the first value, learn. Jason Zahn, our Director of HR Services, will be taking you through some new developments in the Family and Medical Leave Act, or FMLA. It's a lot of detail, so I hope you have your afternoon caffeinated drink ready. For me, today's choice is green tea. So I'm going to take a sip right now. All right, so I'm ready. Oh, and just as a reminder, as we move through, you can post questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer them at the end of the presentation. Jason, they're all yours.
Thank you, Chris. All right, so it's very nice to be talking with you today about the Federal Family Medical Leave Act. I know a lot of you may be in different states and may have different laws, and I will not be covering specific state laws today, but I want to add that if there are any specific state family medical leave questions, certainly feel free to reach out to me after or in the next couple of days. Today, we're going to be talking about employer coverage and employee eligibility, basic provisions of the law, key employer requirements, and employer actions prohibited by the FMLA. Now, this training is really designed for managers and supervisors, and it's really to help you comply with all aspects of the Family Medical Leave Act as it pertains to your business, as well as reducing any risks that you may have as a result of not administering the FMLA policy correctly. So our objectives at the close of today, you're going to be able to state what FMLA is. You're going to be able to cite the basic provisions of the law. You're going to be able to understand employer coverage and employee eligibility, and also avoid actions prohibited by the law. So a little introduction to family medical leave. So it was first passed in 1993. Then went through two revisions, January 16, 2009 and March 8, 2013, which added some of the military caregiver language that's now in the FMLA policy. All federal employment laws, the FMLA is the most popular, most beneficial, and as well as one of the ones that is most often abused when not administered properly. Most employees are aware of the basic requirements, but they're not really up to speed on, the different ways that employers can administer the FMLA leave. So we're going to talk a little bit about some options that you have when administering the leave. It's essential for all supervisors, in addition to HR staff, to know what FMLA is and to understand how to comply. One of the main topics that I get a lot is, how do I teach my supervisors to understand what FMLA is and potential FMLA situations? And we're going to get into a little bit of that as well. The presentation provides that information and will help you make sure that your employees receive the full and correct benefit of the law. So what is FMLA? Again, it was passed in 1993 with two revisions in 2009 and 2013. And what it is, it requires employers who have to comply with the law, and we'll get into who has to comply, grant leave. And leave is basically time away from work. So it's to grant leave for family and medical circumstances, including leave for qualifying exigency for family of members of regular armed forces, National Guard, and reserves. It's also to grant leave to care for a spouse, son, daughter, parent, next of kin covered service member with a serious injury or illness. It also requires you to reinstate the employee to the same or equivalent position at the conclusion of the FMLA leave. And we're going to get into a little bit of what's the same and equivalent position a little bit later on. Continue health benefits. This is a very common mistake that employers make. When employees go on FMLA, they think, oh, I'm not going to cover them because they're not at work. But according to FMLA, you must cover their benefits while they're on FMLA. All other benefits, though, are governed by your company policies. So you want to be very clear that if you're not going to accrue PTO time or other benefits while an employee is on FMLA leave, you want to make sure that you do have that in your policy in your handbook. FMLA also allows states to have more comprehensive provisions, which we've talked about. I know a lot of you from New York, maybe New Jersey, California, definitely have much more enhanced, including paid leave instead of unpaid leave. So again, at the conclusion, feel free to reach out if you'd like to talk about any state laws. So who's covered by the FMLA? A covered employer is one of the following. So a private sector employer with 50 or more employees in 20 or more work weeks. And that's a little confusing. So what that means is if you hover right around that 50 employee mark, they're going to look at, did you have 50 or more employees in 20 or more work weeks in the current or the preceding calendar year. So they're always looking at a calendar year. So if you had 50 employees in 2018 for 20 or more weeks, in 2019, everyone is covered under FMLA. Okay, so you basically, in order to not be covered under the FMLA leave law, you would have to have less than 50 or more employees in the current year and the preceding year. It also includes joint employers. So if you have, if there's an owner of a company that has two different companies, that would be considered a joint employer and would be covered as being a covered employer. All public agencies, including local, state, and federal government, are automatically covered by FMLA, including public and private elementary schools and secondary schools, regardless of the number of employees they have. Employees covered by FMLA. So an eligible employee is an employee of a covered employer who, first, they have at least 12 months. Now, again, certain state laws, FMLA goes right into effect right away according to the state, but for federal, you have to have 12 months of service with that employer. You also have to have worked 1,250 hours during the 12 months immediately preceding the commencement of the leave. So again, 12 months and 1,250 hours. And then the third is that the employer has to have 50 or more employees within 75 miles. So if you have two different locations and they're within 75 miles, as the crow flies, then you are a covered employer. There's also a note over on the right. The 12 months of employment need not be consecutive. So separate periods of employment will be counted. So if there's an employee who had 3 months of service and then they were laid off for 3 months and then they came back and they're still active, you would still count that entire time period. The only way you would not count the break in service is if it was 7 years or more. So let's get into the basic provisions of FMLA. So we talked about that it's a requirement to give them leave, meaning time away from work, and the amount of time that you're required to give them is up to 12 weeks in a 12-month period as defined by the employer for the following circumstances. So the first circumstance is the birth of a son or daughter and the care for the newborn child. Pretty self-explanatory. This does apply to both the mother and the father. The expectant mother may take FMLA leave for prenatal care, time off during pregnancy for difficult pregnancies, recovery after birth, and bonding with the newborn child. Now, this is one thing that a lot of employers they get wrong a lot. Somebody goes out prior to delivery. Typically, it's going to be disability, depending on the state and if you have a disability policy. But a lot of employers don't understand that you can actually count that disability period as part of their FMLA. It's very common that employers let an employee go out on disability for prior to delivery, maybe 6 weeks prior, and then they give them an additional 12 weeks after delivery. Now, according to the FMLA, federal FMLA, you don't have to do that. If they took 6 weeks before delivery, they would only be eligible for 6 weeks after delivery. Now, keep in mind, state laws vary, so there are some requirements with that, especially New Jersey. So what I just said does not take place for New Jersey, but if you're just under the Federal Family Medical Leave Act, you do not need to give more than 12 weeks. The expectant father may also take FMLA to attend prenatal care appointments, care for the spouse, and then bonding with the newborn child. Second circumstance is placement with the employee of a son or daughter for adoption or foster care. So pretty self-explanatory. This leave must be given before the actual placement or adoption if an absence from work is required for the placement to proceed. And then leave is also available for bonding with the child after adoption or placement. The third and the fourth, 3 is the care for the employee's spouse, son, daughter, or parent with a serious health condition. And then the fourth one is a serious health condition that makes the employee unable to perform the functions of the employee's job. In many cases, this would be under a disability policy or a state disability policy. Both of these circumstances cover illnesses of a serious and long-term nature. So generally, a chronic or long-term health condition that results in a period of 3 consecutive days of incapacity, with the first visit to the healthcare provider within 7 days of the missed day, and a second visit within 30 days. Okay, this is key for supervisors to be able to recognize this. One of the major calls that I get is, hey, I want to terminate this employee for attendance, and my first thing is, all right, let me look at the attendance record, and I see the first thing I look at is how many consecutive days has there been, and if I ever see 3 consecutive days, my first question is, what was this absence for? And if they say, well, the employee didn't have a car, that's fine, that counts. But if they say, well, the employee was sick for 3 days, my next question is going to be, did you offer family medical leave? And if they didn't, I would tell them that you probably can't count those 3 days for the attendance record. And the reason is because most courts are going to look at that and ask the employer, why didn't you offer them family medical leave? Very, very common mistake that employers make. So three consecutive days is really a key in administering your FMLA leave. So the fifth circumstance is the care for a covered service member. This is one of the ones that was added in one of the recent revisions. So it's the care for a service member with a serious injury or illness if the employee is the spouse, child, parent, or next of kin of the service member. So a couple qualifying exigency are short-term deployment, military events, childcare and school activities, financial and legal arrangements, counseling, rest and recuperation up to 15 days, and post-deployment activities. And we get to the sixth. Now, the sixth circumstance, this one is the care for a spouse, son, daughter, parent, or next of kin covered service member with a serious injury occurred in the line of duty. Now, this one is the only one that requires you to give more than 12 weeks. This circumstance allows for 26 weeks in a 12-month period. And just a couple of notes, next of kin is defined as closest blood relative of the injured or recovering service member. And this FMLA leave, this category is also considered for what's known as military caregiver leave. Also under the covered service member, you have prenatal care. So an employee may take leave to care for the parent of the military member who is incapable of self-care. And then you have additional activities that arise out of active duty, provided that the company and the employee agree, including agreement on timing and duration of leave. So let's look at the FMLA 12-month period. An employer is permitted to choose one of the following methods for determining the 12-month period. So basically, as an employer, you have 4 options. You can choose a calendar year. You can choose any fixed month, 12-month period, such as a fiscal year, so maybe a July through June. You could do a 12-month period measured forward from the date the employee's first absence begins, or you can do a rolling 12-month period measured backward. In my experience and in dealing with questions on FMLA, most employers use a rolling 12-month backward. That just seems to be the easiest to manage. So they're basically looking at, when the leave started, and then they're going backwards 12 months to determine where that 12-month period is to see how much time they have used and what they have left. Just as if you decide to use a calendar year, the calendar year is so somebody goes out in December and they come back in February. If you're using a calendar year, you're basically counting December for 1 year and you're counting January and February for the next year. So it gets a little tricky to manage, but that's why I really like the rolling 12-month period, because you're always looking backwards from the date the employee uses any FMLA leave. So a couple of circumstances here. If you have any spouses working together, husband and wife, that does not mean that they both get 12 weeks. Combined, they get 12 weeks. So no matter which of the circumstances they choose or they use, they still only get a combined of 12 weeks. So if the typical scenario would be husband and wife working in the same company, mother gives birth, mother takes 6 weeks after disability, and then 6 weeks for the father. That's typically a scenario that I see a lot. The only exception would be for the covered ill or injured service member, where it's a combined 26 weeks. Remember, that was the one that had 26 weeks instead of 12 weeks. So combined, they can only take 26 weeks in that case. Intermittent leave. So the law does require employers to accept intermittent leave, except when it's taken after the birth or placement of a child for adoption or foster care. You do not have to take or accept intermittent leave in that case. All other FMLA absences, you would be required to accept intermittent leave, mostly because you don't know when they're going to be calling off. So it's automatically intermittent in itself. So FMLA and paid leave. This is another common mistake that employers make. FMLA does not require paid leave as far as the federal Family Medical Leave Act is concerned, but there are certainly state laws that do require paid leave. If you are not required to pay according to the state, then employers are able to use any paid leave that the employee has. So accrued leave would be sick leave, vacation leave, workers' comp, disability insurance, or PTO. So as long as you have it in your policy that you require employees to use paid time off before unpaid time off, that is perfectly acceptable. So certification requirements. You are, as an employer, allowed to require employees to submit certifications for the need for leave. So typical certifications would be employee serious health condition, family member serious health condition, qualifying exigency for military family leave, and serious injury or illness of covered service members. So you are able to require them to submit certifications for these type of absences or leaves. Employee requirements. Employees must provide verbal or written notice of the need to the HR manager or their supervisor. When the need for leave is foreseeable, the employee must provide at least 30 days notice. We know that's not always possible. So if the request for leave is less than 30 days, the employee must provide notice of the need with either on the same day or the next business day. Also, when the need is not foreseeable, the employee must comply with your company policy for requesting leave absent unusual circumstances. And then within 5 business days, the employee has provided this notice, the HR manager will provide the employee with notice of eligibility and rights. Now, this is one thing that I strongly recommend, is that when the employee requests the family medical leave, do not tell the employee that they're eligible right away. Go back, make sure that they, number one, had the 12 months of service. Number two, 1,250 hours. Number three, obviously make sure that you have over 50 employees that are covered by the law. But once they do, that will trigger everything else that you know, as far as giving the employee the FMLA paperwork for them to complete, giving them the copy of the policy, or if you have a handbook, giving them a copy of the handbook and pointing out that. So again, notifying the employee of their rights, and then providing notices to an employee when you are made aware of a potential need for FMLA. Do make sure that you continue health benefits at the same level. There can be nothing that changes. It has to be the exact same health benefit at the exact same cost. Common question that I get is, hey, this employee is on unpaid leave. How do I cover the employee portion of the benefit costs? There's two options really. Number one is you can require an employee to make regular payments to stay on the health insurance. So it's as simple as them writing a check to the company and then you covering the cost of the benefits. The second, and probably the more common method that I see, is employees not paying for their benefits until they return to work. Now, yes, there is a chance that the employee doesn't come back and you'd be stuck with that. But if they do have any PTO time, you can certainly take it out of their PTO if you're paying that out once they do not return to work. So that's just, you know, 2 methods that you have as far as covering the benefits while they're out. And then reinstating the employee to the same or equivalent position. So same or equivalent would mean similar in pay and similar in duties. So you want to make sure that, you know, you don't want to have an employee that's making $15 an hour come back to a $7 an hour job. That won't fly. You want to make sure that the position is very similar to the position. It could have some of the same duties or require some of the same education, but it should be a similar position. I would just caution you to make sure that the pay is almost the same. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but make sure it's close to equivalent as well as the position. And quite honestly, most of our clients, when they have a question about this, we advise them, if at all possible, to try to hire a temp for the period of FMLA so that the person can fill right into the position that they vacated during the FMLA time. Some things that are prohibited by FMLA. So making pre-hire inquiries regarding need for FMLA, kind of a no-brainer. FMLA should never come up during an interview. Including periods of FMLA to disqualify employees for good attendance awards, very, very common. I do get a lot of calls about, you know, attendance bonuses or just general all-employee bonuses. And the question is, do I have to give them the full amount? And the answer is, if they are approved on FMLA, the answer is yes. So they could potentially be out of work for 12 weeks. And if you have a good attendance bonus where somebody doesn't miss any work, you give them a bonus. If they were out for that entire time, they would still be eligible for that bonus if they did not miss any days other than their FMLA time. Asking employees for a doctor's note each time they use intermittent leave, you cannot do that. You can ask them to certify twice a year, but you cannot ask them for a doctor's note each time they use intermittent leave. And then finally, retaliating against employees who file FMLA complaints or exercise their FMLA rights. Retaliation is never a good idea. And then interfering with an employee's rights under FMLA, and then retaliating against employees who file FMLA complaints or exercise their FMLA rights, which we talked about. FMLA uses the same definition of employer as the FLSA and includes any person acting directly or indirectly in the interest of an employer. So this means that if you have, an HR consultant that you use to make decisions about FMLA, you could be held that person, as well as the managers at your company, could be held liable for violations of the requirements of FMLA. So just keep that in mind, that you could be individually liable if you are, doing anything that is prohibited by the FMLA law. So to summarize, FMLA is the federal law that requires employers to grant leave for family and medical circumstances and to reinstate the employee in the same or equivalent position upon conclusion of the leave. We talked about the 6 FMLA circumstances: birth of a child, or to care for a newborn child, placement for adoption or foster care, care for spouse, child, or parent with a serious health condition, care for yourself with a serious health condition, qualifying exigency for family of members of the armed forces, and care of a spouse, child, parent, or next of kin of a covered service member. And remember, circumstances 1 through 5, it's 12 weeks. Circumstance number 6, it's 26 weeks in the 12-month period. Employees may take FMLA leave intermittently on a reduced work schedule, except for the one where where it's to care for a newborn. That is the only one where you do not need to accept intermittent. They can request intermittent, but you do not need to accept it in that case. Employees requesting FMLA leave must provide verbal or written notice. And then within 5 business days after the employee has submitted appropriate certification, HR manager will complete and provide a written response. Typically what I see here is there is an FMLA approval letter that you pretty much just put the employee name, and you put the FMLA start, FMLA end date, and you send that the employee basically accepting all future FMLA occurrences through the period that's in the letter. So an example of this would be somebody with migraines that might need to take off time when they do get a migraine. When you get the certification from the physician, they're going to say that this is for a certain period of time. It might be from today up until a year from now. In the letter, you're going to say that any absences regarding related to your migraine will be covered under FMLA, and they're basically covered for that period of time. After that 1-year period of time, you can request them to recertify. So that would give them a different time frame. They would have a new FMLA letter with a new period of time for FMLA absences. An employee is eligible for FMLA leave when they have been employed by a covered employer for at least 12 months and worked 1,250 hours. And remember that the employer has to have 50 or more employees within a 75-mile work site. And again, remember that 20 work weeks of the preceding or the current calendar year. Remember to never make pre-hire inquiries. Always include periods of FMLA when making decisions regarding attendance awards or non-performance bonuses. ask for doctor's notes each time intermittent FMLA is used. You don't do that. And then interfere with employees' FMLA rights or retaliate against employees who file FMLA complaints. So that is the end of the presentation. I know there's probably some questions that we have, and I'm certainly available to go through them.
Thank you so much, Jason. Yeah, we had a few questions trickle in, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you those. Hopefully you can give us some insight. Just
Okay.
a quick reminder, if anyone had any further thoughts that pop up, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So go ahead and just type those in there, and we'll be happy to get to those. So Jason, someone asked, how do you schedule and run a business if you do not know when the team member needs the day off with intermittent leave?
That's a really good question. One of the reasons that FMLA is 50 or more employees is because they figure that that there could be somebody that would be able to cover the work for those unscheduled absences. I don't really have a much better answer other than that. You know, if it was a 10-man company and they said that you had to give FMLA for a 10-person company, I don't think that would fly. But because it's 50, they figure you're large enough that you'll be able to cover that work for the unscheduled absence.
Makes sense. Another question, what would you do to have your employees be conscious about your staffing needs in terms of their appointments?
So really good question. So I would ask the employee to try to schedule their appointments when times are slow or when it's more convenient for the company. It's perfectly acceptable to have that conversation. The problem is that comes up a lot is there's usually specialists involved and you're at the beck and call of the specialist. So it's really hard to enforce that, but you certainly can ask that.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Thank you so much. That's all we have for today. So we will be delivering a recording of this to your inboxes in case you want to pass it along to anyone else on your team that you think could benefit from it. But thank you so much, Jason, and thanks for everyone for joining us this afternoon. Have a
Thank
good
you,
day.
everybody.
Yes, thanks everyone.